The morning Harlan Voss drove his buggy straight through Mara Whitfield's carefully packed belongings, scattering everything she owned across the frozen mud of the depot platform. He did not stop. He did not look back. He simply flicked his reins and called over his shoulder, loud enough for every person on that platform to hear, "Clear the way. Charity cases don't get to block paying customers." 4 boys stood frozen in the cold. The youngest, Benji, was 6 years old and still holding the handle of a busted tin pail. He looked up at his mother and asked the question nobody with any decency could answer. "Mama, what did we do wrong?" She had no answer. She never did in those days. If you've ever been made to feel like your existence was an inconvenience, if you've ever stood somewhere and felt the whole world silently agree that you didn't belong, then you already know exactly what Mara Whitfield felt on that platform. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. Because what happened next in Red Hollow was either a miracle or a mistake, depending on who you asked. This is the story of a rancher who said yes when everyone else said no, and what it cost him, and what it built. If this kind of story speaks to you, the kind that makes you think about what family really means, consider subscribing to this channel and following along with us. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Buset. The train had been running 4 hours behind schedule, which meant Mara and her boys arrived in Red Hollow in the dead of a January afternoon, when the light was already bleeding out of the sky and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made your back teeth ache. She had been awake for 22 hours. She knew because she'd counted them, the way you do when you're too anxious to sleep and too exhausted to think straight. Wyatt, her oldest at 16, had offered to take the youngest boys to the back of the car so she could rest, and she'd said yes. And then she'd sat alone in the rattling dark and stared at the letter in her lap until she had it memorized. I run a cattle operation outside Red Hollow. I am 38 years old, I am not a handsome man, and I won't pretend otherwise. I have land, a working house, and more rooms than I know what to do with. What I don't have is a family. I read your advertisement with interest. A woman of practical experience and honest character is what I'm looking for. I don't require anything more than honesty. Caleb Dawson. She'd read a dozen letters like it over the past year and a half. Most of them fell apart at the same point, when she wrote back explaining that she came with 4 children. The responses after that tended to follow a pattern. Sometimes polite, sometimes not. One man had written back 3 words. That is unfortunate. Caleb Dawson had written back 6 sentences. I read your reply carefully. 4 boys sounds like 4 sets of working hands to me. I won't pretend I know how to raise children, because I don't, but I know how to run a fair household and treat people with respect. If you're willing to take a chance on a rough-edged rancher, I'm willing to take a chance on you and yours. Write back and tell me what you need. She had read those 6 sentences so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The platform at Red Hollow was not much to look at. A narrow wooden structure badly in need of fresh paint, a single gas lamp already lit against the early dark, and a crowd of maybe 30 people either arriving or watching others leave. The station master was arguing with a freight handler. 2 women in good wool coats were watching the arriving passengers the way people watch the start of a race, not with warmth, with assessment. Mara stepped off the train first, gripping the battered suitcase with both hands, because the latch on one side had broken somewhere around the 3rd stop, and she'd had to hold it shut since Iowa. Wyatt came down behind her carrying Benji, because Benji had finally fallen asleep in the last hour, and she hadn't wanted to wake him. Cole followed, 12 years old and trying to look like he wasn't scared, which mostly worked unless you looked at his hands, which were clasped in front of him tight enough to whiten the knuckles. Milo came last, 9 years old, and already craning his neck in every direction like he was cataloging everything he saw. She set the suitcase down to reorient herself and look for a man she had never met. That was when Harlan Voss happened. She heard the horse before she saw the buggy. A high, sharp clatter of hooves moving too fast for a depot platform, and then the wheel caught the corner of her suitcase, and the thing flew open and 3 years' worth of carefully folded and repaired life exploded across the frozen mud. A dress. 2 of Benji's shirts. The tin of sewing needles she'd had since before the boys were born. A framed photograph that hit the platform edge and skidded, and she watched it go without being able to move fast enough to stop it. Harlan Voss was a thick-necked man in a good coat who didn't stop the horse, didn't slow it, and said the thing he said without looking down from his seat with anything resembling regret. The words landed the way he meant them to, publicly, cleanly, without apology. Several people on the platform turned to look. A few of them looked away, again quickly. A few didn't. Milo had already dropped to his knees in the mud and was chasing a rolling tin of buttons. Cole stood perfectly still with an expression on his face that Mara recognized. The particular blankness her second son got when he was working very hard not to cry, and even harder, not to let anyone know it. Wyatt, still holding his sleeping brother, watched the buggy go with a look in his eyes that Mara did not like at all. She would need to address that look later. Benji woke up from the noise and asked his question. She crouched down in the mud beside Milo and started gathering what could be gathered. Her knees were wet immediately. The photograph, it was of the 4 boys and her late sister, taken 3 summers ago, had a crack across the glass now, running through the image like a fault line, but the picture itself wasn't ruined. She held it for a moment longer than she needed to. "Mrs. Whitfield?" The voice came from behind her and slightly to the left, and it was not what she expected. She'd built a picture of Caleb Dawson in her mind from his letter. Practical, steady, possibly gruff. And the voice matched the letter in ways she couldn't quite describe. Not loud, not performing anything, just there. She stood up, still holding the photograph, with mud on both knees and her hair coming loose from the pins she'd fixed it with before the last stop. The man standing behind her was tall enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to meet his eyes. He had a weathered face, not old but used, the kind of face that had spent its years outdoors and didn't apologize for it. He wore a heavy coat that had clearly been cleaned recently, which meant he'd made an effort, which meant something. He had a hat in his hands rather than on his head, which also meant something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. He looked at her. He looked at the boys. He looked at the mud and the scattered belongings and the broken suitcase without any visible reaction beyond a slight adjustment of his jaw. "I'm Caleb," he said. "I'd have been here sooner, but your train came in early from the last stop, which is the first time I've heard of that happening." "Late," she said, because she was too tired to make conversation. "It was 4 hours late." He frowned, the way a man frowns when something doesn't add up. "The station master told me early." The station master was wrong. He considered this and nodded once. "That tracks." He usually is. He put his hat back on, crouched down beside Milo without another word, and started picking things up from the ground. He did it the way a person does a practical task, efficiently, without theater. He gathered the buttons back into their tin by hand, pressed the lid closed, and set it inside what remained of the suitcase. He picked up the dress without holding it out at arm's length, the way some men did with women's things, just folded it roughly and put it in. Milo was staring at him. Caleb looked at the boy. "You're Milo." "How do you know that?" "Your mother described all 4 of you in her letter, said you were 9, dark-haired, and that you'd probably be the first one off the train looking for something to climb." Milo thought about this. "I didn't climb anything." "Train was moving," Caleb said. "Give yourself credit for the restraint." Something shifted in Milo's face that Mara saw but couldn't quite name. Caleb stood, gathered the broken suitcase in one hand, holding the broken latch shut the exact same way she had been doing it, and looked at Wyatt, who was still holding Benji and still had that expression. "That's a long time to carry a 6-year-old, Caleb said. "You want to put him in the wagon bed? I've got a blanket back there. He won't feel the cold." Wyatt's jaw moved. "He's fine where he is." A pause. Not a confrontational one. Caleb didn't seem to be built for confrontation, or at least not the petty kind. "All right," he said. "Wagon's this way." They walked through the depot and out to where the wagon was hitched, and Mara noticed that 2 or 3 people watched them go with the particular quality of attention that meant they were memorizing details to repeat later. She'd learned to recognize that look in the last 2 years. It usually preceded the kind of talk that traveled faster than the truth. The wagon was clean, which she noticed because she noticed everything, a habit she'd developed when you couldn't afford to miss anything. There was a blanket in the bed, as promised, folded square. Caleb loaded the suitcase without ceremony, and Wyatt finally, carefully, settled Benji in the wagon bed and tucked the blanket around him, and Benji didn't wake up, and something in Wyatt's shoulders let go slightly. Cole climbed up without help. Milo started to do the same and misjudged the height, and Caleb caught him by the back of the coat without comment, just steadied him, and let him scramble up under his own power. Mara accepted Caleb's offered hand to climb up to the bench seat, because her legs were tired enough that declining would have been pride over sense, and she had burned through most of her available pride somewhere around the state line. They drove out of Red Hollow in the last gray light of the afternoon, and nobody spoke for a long time, which should have been uncomfortable and somehow wasn't. The road was frozen ruts, which meant the wagon jolted and shuddered, and Benji stirred once and settled again. Caleb drove with the reins loose in his hands, not fighting the horse, just guiding. "Who was that man?" Wyatt said from the wagon bed. "With the buggy." It wasn't a question exactly, more like a test to see what Caleb would say. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Voss. He owns the mill and 300 acres north of town. He's important," Wyatt said. Again, not a question. "He thinks so," Caleb said. "Whether that's true depends on what you think makes a man important." Wyatt sat with that for a bit. "What do you think makes a man important?" Caleb's jaw moved once. "What he does when he's got nothing to gain from doing the right thing." Nobody answered that. Milo was watching the dark tree line passing on the right side of the road. Cole had his arms wrapped around himself against the cold, or something else. Benji slept. Mara was looking straight ahead at the road and thinking about what she'd said to Wyatt 3 weeks ago, when he'd come to her with the letter and asked whether she was sure. She told him she wasn't sure of anything except that where they were wasn't working. He'd accepted that the way Wyatt accepted most hard things, which was to say, on the outside it looked like acceptance, and on the inside she suspected it looked nothing like that. She'd thought about her boys every mile of that train ride, what they were riding toward, what they might be giving up, whether any of it was fair. It wasn't. She knew that. Nothing about the past 2 years had been fair, and she'd stopped expecting it, but that didn't stop her thinking it, usually at 2 in the morning when the thinking was worst. She'd started over twice already. She knew what it cost. The first time, she'd been young enough to believe starting over got easier. The second time had taught her differently. This was the third time. She was 34 years old and her knees were muddy and her suitcase was held shut by a man's hand and her youngest child was asleep in a stranger's wagon. "Is the house warm?" she asked. "I stoked the fire before I left," Caleb said. "Should be. The chimney runs good." "Good," she said. That was all. But it was enough for the moment. The Dawson Ranch came into view about 20 minutes outside of town, announced first by the smell of cattle, and then by a long fence line running parallel to the road, and then by the house itself. A 2-story structure that was not grand but was solidly built, the kind of building that looked like it had been put up by someone who intended it to last rather than to impress. There were lights in 2 windows downstairs, smoke from the chimney. Milo sat up in the wagon bed when he saw it. "It's big," he said. "It's too big for one person," Caleb said, pulling the horse up near the barn. "That's been the problem." He got down, tied off, and came around to the back of the wagon without fuss. Cole climbed down himself. Milo jumped, landed wrong, caught himself without falling. Wyatt lifted Benji carefully, and the little boy woke this time, eyes confused and unfocused, looking around at the dark and the unfamiliar shapes. "Where are we?" Benji asked. "We're here," Mara told him. He looked at the house. He looked at Caleb. "Is that the man from the letter?" "Yes," Mara said. Benji studied Caleb with the frank, merciless scrutiny of a 6-year-old. "You're tall," he concluded. "I am," Caleb agreed. "Do you have a dog?" "I don't," Caleb said. He reached out and opened the gate to the yard. "But I've been thinking about getting one." Benji considered this as Wyatt carried him through the gate. "Can I help pick?" "I expect you'll have opinions," Caleb said. Benji nodded, satisfied, and laid his head back against his brother's shoulder. They went inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and something that had been cooking, which turned out to be a pot of beans on the stove that Caleb had left on low before he left. There was cornbread wrapped in a cloth on the kitchen table. Mara hadn't eaten since the sandwich she'd split with the boys somewhere around midday, and the sight of the cornbread hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way she wasn't prepared for. She didn't say anything about it. She just sat down when Caleb gestured to the chairs and let the warmth of the kitchen come back into her hands. Cole found the cornbread first because Cole was always the one who found the food. He stood near the table and didn't touch it, and looked at Caleb. "You can have some," Caleb said. "All of you. That's what it's there for." Cole broke off a piece and ate it standing up, and closed his eyes for a second in a way that 12-year-olds don't usually let anyone see. Mara saw it. She was watching her boys the same way she always watched them. The constant, low-level monitoring of a woman who had learned that the world could change on them fast and that she needed to see the changes coming. Wyatt sat Benji in a chair and stood with his back to the wall nearest the door. Still watching, still not all the way in. Caleb sat down across from Mara, which meant he wasn't standing over her, which she noticed and filed away. He put his hat on the table beside him, ran a hand through his hair once, and looked at her with the kind of directness that some people found uncomfortable, and she had learned to trust more than the other kind. "I know this isn't what you were expecting," he said. "I didn't know what I was expecting," she told him honestly. "Fair," he said. "I didn't either." He looked at the table for a second. "I want to say something to your boys, if that's all right." She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's eyes moved between her and Caleb, but he didn't say anything. She nodded. Caleb turned so he was addressing all four of them. Wyatt at the wall, Cole at the table, Milo, who was trying to see everything in the kitchen at once, Benji, who was eating cornbread and leaning against Wyatt's arm. "I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy," Caleb said, "or that everything's going to be fine. I don't know that. What I know is that this house has been empty a long time, and I've been working land that's bigger than one man should work alone, and that I needed people in it. People who knew what work was. I'm not looking for anyone to be grateful or to behave a certain way because they think they owe me something. I'm looking for people who'll show up." He stopped. He looked at Wyatt specifically. "You can leave that wall any time," he said. "Nobody's blocking the door." Wyatt looked at him for a long moment. Then he pushed off the wall, walked to the table, and sat down. It was a small thing, the smallest possible version of a gesture. Mara picked up a piece of cornbread with hands that had stopped trembling and thought about 3 weeks ago, when she'd told Wyatt she wasn't sure of anything. She was still not sure of anything. Not this man, not this house, not this valley, but the fire was warm, the cornbread was real, and all four of her boys were in the same room and not afraid, or at least not showing it anymore. She had built whole lives on less than that. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. The sound of cattle came faint through the walls. Somewhere across the valley, a barn door was banging loose on its hinge, and in the morning it would need fixing, and that would be another thing, the first of many, to figure out. But that was morning. Tonight, for the first time in 200 miles, nobody was moving. The barn door had been banging since before dawn. Mara heard it in the dark, that irregular slapping rhythm cutting through the wind, and she lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room and let herself remember where she was. The ceiling was lower than she'd expected. The mattress had a ridge running down the middle where the springs had given out on one side. The window faced east, and the first gray light was just beginning to press against the glass. She'd slept 4 hours, maybe 5. It felt like 2. She dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp, habit from years of not wanting to wake the boys, and went downstairs to find Caleb already gone from the house. The stove had been stoked. Recently, the iron was still ticking with heat, and there was a pot of water on for coffee. He'd left before she woke up, which told her something about the hours he kept, and she filed it away the same way she filed everything, quietly, without deciding yet what it meant. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup and looked out at the yard. The light was coming up pale and flat, and she could see the barn, and beyond it the fence lines running out into the gray, and beyond that nothing but the open land rolling away into the distance. Red Hollow was somewhere back the way they'd come. The town she'd seen only in darkness, from a wagon seat, with mud drying on her knees. The barn door was still banging. She went outside. The cold hit her like a flat hand. She pulled her coat tighter and walked across the yard, which was frozen solid underfoot and uneven enough that she had to watch where she was stepping. The banging grew louder as she got closer to the barn, and when she rounded the corner, she found the source, a side door with a broken latch, swinging wide every time the wind gusted from the north. She grabbed it, held it closed, and looked around for something to wedge it with. There was nothing immediately useful, so she just held it. She stood there in the cold holding a barn door shut and thought, not for the first time, that her life had a way of giving her exactly this kind of situation. The sort that was nobody's emergency and everybody's problem, that required someone to just stand there and deal with it until a better solution presented itself. She'd been dealing with things like this for 2 years. Longer, if she was honest. She heard boots behind her and turned. Wyatt was crossing the yard with a length of rope in one hand and an expression that said he'd already diagnosed the problem. He was 16 and he moved like he was 22, which was something that caught her off guard sometimes. The way her oldest son's body had gotten ahead of who he still was on the inside. He didn't say anything about her being out there already, just came alongside her, assessed the door and the frame, and started looping the rope through the handle and around the post in a configuration that would hold it until the latch got replaced. "How long have you been up?" she asked. "While." He tied off the rope with a final practiced pull. "Cole's still asleep. Milo's in the hayloft." "Already?" "He woke up before me." She looked at the barn door, now secured. "You didn't have to come out here." Wyatt gave her a sideways look that was entirely his father's. Her late husband had the same quality of glance, the kind that communicated an entire disagreement without a word. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and she followed, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was the first morning. The second morning was harder in different ways, and the third was harder still, because the strangeness of the first day wore off fast, and what was underneath it was the actual work of being in a new place with a man they didn't know, and a set of expectations that nobody had quite put into words yet. Caleb was not an easy man to read. He wasn't cold. That much was clear quickly. He didn't ignore the boys or treat them like furniture, didn't talk to Mara about them as if they weren't present, but he also didn't perform warmth in the way she'd half expected, some overcompensating version of cheerfulness designed to make everyone comfortable. He was simply there, doing things, working. And when a boy showed up near what he was doing, he let the boy watch. And when the boy asked a question, he answered it, and that was more or less the extent of the early relationship. Milo was the first one to break through, which surprised no one. It happened on the fourth day when Caleb was working on a section of fence along the east pasture. Milo had followed him out there, not asked, just appeared, and Caleb had neither invited him nor sent him back. He'd handed the boy a pair of leather gloves too large for his hands and shown him how to hold the wire taut while the post was being set. Milo had done it without complaining about the cold or the awkwardness of the oversized gloves. And when Caleb said "good" at the end of it, one word, no elaboration, Milo came back to the house that evening with a quality of satisfaction on him that Mara recognized from when her boys accomplished something they hadn't been sure they could do. She said nothing about it. She'd learned that saying something was often the surest way to make a boy self-conscious about whatever good thing had just happened to him. Cole was more difficult, and she knew it, and she'd known it coming. Cole had been the quietest since his father died, which was saying something because he'd never been loud. He was the kind of child who processed everything internally and released it in small pieces, a question here, a comment there, and you had to be paying attention or you'd miss it entirely. He'd been 12 when they lost the farm. 12 and already old enough to understand what losing it meant. He didn't warm to Caleb exactly, but on the fifth morning Mara came into the barn to find Cole crouched beside one of the horses, running his hand along the animal's foreleg, and Caleb standing a few feet back watching him with an expression she hadn't seen on the man's face before. Something between curiosity and restraint, like he wanted to say something but was deciding whether to say it. "She's been favoring that leg," Caleb said, finally, addressing Cole's back. Cole didn't look up. "There's heat in it, right here." He pressed 2 fingers gently against a spot just below the knee. "Not a lot, but it's there." Caleb came closer and crouched down beside him and felt the same spot. His jaw moved. "I missed that." Cole finally looked at him. "It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it." "How do you know to look?" A pause. "We had a mule back home. She used to get hot in that same place when the ground was too hard. My father showed me." He stood up, brushing hay off his knees. "I can check the others if you want." Caleb looked at him for a moment in the way of a person recalibrating something. "Yeah," he said, "I want." Mara left before either of them saw her standing there. Wyatt was the one who took the longest, and she'd expected that too. Wyatt had been the man of the household for going on 2 years, in the way that oldest children become the man of the household when there isn't one, Not because anyone asks them to, but because they simply take on the weight before anyone thinks to tell them they don't have to. He'd been doing it since the week after the funeral, when he'd started getting up earlier than her to start the fire, started walking behind her and the younger boys when they went into town, started sleeping lighter and listening harder. It wasn't something she'd wanted for him. It was something she hadn't been able to stop. He watched Caleb the way you watch a man whose motives you haven't figured out yet. Not hostile, not openly, just careful. He helped with what needed doing because Wyatt was constitutionally incapable of not helping with things that needed doing, but he kept himself at a distance that wasn't about physical space. It was the other kind, the kind that was harder to cross. Caleb seemed to understand this, or at least to respect it, which Mara appreciated more than she said. What he didn't do was push. He didn't try to manufacture moments with Wyatt, didn't find excuses to praise him where it would be obvious, didn't do any of the things that a lesser man might do to try to earn the boys' approval. He just treated Wyatt the same way he treated everyone, with a blunt, uncomplicated straightforwardness that had no performance in it. The first real test came on a Wednesday, 10 days in, when one of the ranch hands came to report that a section of the north fence had been cut. Not broken, not damaged by weather, cut. Caleb's face when he heard this was not a face Mara had seen on him before. Something went very still in it. Not anger exactly, or not just that. Something older and colder than anger. "How much of it?" he asked the ranch hand. "2 panels. Maybe 3. Hard to say until you see it." "Which pasture?" "Near the creek bend, where the Voss property runs alongside." Caleb looked at the man for a long moment. Then he got his coat from the hook by the door and went out. Mara stood in the kitchen after he left and turned the name over in her mind. Voss. The man from the depot. The thick-necked man in the good coat who hadn't stopped his buggy or looked back. She felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The sensation of understanding that the thing that had been done to her on that platform wasn't an accident or an exception. It was a pattern. It was who that man was. Wyatt was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "You heard that?" she asked. "Some of it." He leaned against the frame. "The fence, you mean?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that going to be a problem?" "I don't know," she said, which was the truth. "We don't know enough yet." He nodded slowly, in the way he had of accepting information he didn't like. "That man from the station," he said. "Voss." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you're thinking," she said, "and I need you to not think it yet. Give this place a chance to show us what it is before you decide." Wyatt's jaw worked. He was 16 and he thought he'd already figured out what the world was, which was the specific problem of being 16. But he also trusted her, underneath everything, and after a moment he pushed off the doorframe and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Caleb came back 2 hours later with mud on his boots and a look on his face that had resolved into something quieter and harder to read. He sat down at the kitchen table, and Mara put coffee in front of him without asking. 3 panels, he said. "Voss?" she asked. He looked at her with a brief expression that might have been surprise. That she'd gotten there quickly, or that she'd said it directly, she wasn't sure. "Can't prove it," he said. "His property runs right along that section. His cattle were through the break before I got there. 40, maybe 50 head. What does that mean?" "It means I've got to account for any damage to my herd. Could mean cattle mixing, could mean disease transfer, could mean lost animals." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Or it could mean nothing, if we're lucky." "Are you usually lucky?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I'm usually careful, which is different." She sat down across from him. This was the first time they'd sat across from each other since that first night, and the table between them felt like a different kind of distance in the daylight. Not awkward, exactly, but honest in a way that couldn't be ignored. "Tell me about him," she said. Caleb drank his coffee. He seemed to be deciding how much to say, or how to say it, in the way of a person who doesn't narrate things naturally. "Harlan Voss has been trying to buy my north pasture for 6 years, he said finally. "I've said no 6 times. He doesn't take it well when people say no." "He's done this before? The fence?" "Something like it. Hard to prove. He's careful." He set the cup down. "He's been waiting for me to make a mistake. Something to give him leverage, or to run me into enough trouble that selling starts to look like the better option. She let that settle. And now you've got 5 more people to account for. He looked at her. That's not how I see it. How do you see it? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, she could see Milo crossing the yard with something in his arms. Couldn't tell what from this distance, but the purposeful way he was moving meant he'd found something that needed attending to. Cole was behind him. They were talking, though she couldn't hear it. I see it as 5 more reasons to not let him win, Caleb said. She held his gaze and looked for the performance in it. The man saying the right thing because it was the right thing to say. She'd learned to recognize that look over 2 years of necessity. She didn't find it. Okay, she said. The trouble with Harlan Voss did not stay confined to cut fence lines. The following week, Mara took the boys into Red Hollow to buy flour and a few other things they'd run short of. She didn't ask Caleb to come because she'd been buying things on her own for 2 years, and she wasn't inclined to stop now, and because she wanted to see the town on her own terms, without a buffer. What she found was a small town that already had opinions. The woman at the dry goods store was polite in the brittle way of someone who has agreed to be polite and is finding the effort noticeable. She answered Mara's questions and helped her find what she needed and made no conversation beyond the transaction. 2 women near the front of the store talked to each other in voices calibrated just loud enough to carry. Those are Caleb Dawson's new arrangement, one of them said. She said arrangement the way you might say problem. Mara did not look up from the flour barrel. 4 boys, the other one said. 4. And a woman he's never met before. Only thing he knows about her is what she put in an advertisement. That's not how you build a family. That's not how you build anything. Mara paid for what she'd come for and left without hurrying, because hurrying would have told them something she didn't want to give them. Benji was holding her hand. Milo was close on her left. Cole and Wyatt were behind her. She got them outside and kept walking toward the wagon. Mama, Milo said. I heard it, she said. Keep walking. We don't have to. Milo. He went quiet. They reached the wagon and she loaded the flour and the other things and got the boys up and got herself up and took the reins. She was 3 streets away from the dry goods store when her hands finally stopped being tight on the reins. She didn't say anything to the boys about it that day or that night, but she lay awake for a long time after the house went quiet, staring at the low ceiling, running through the ledger she'd been keeping in her head since they'd arrived. The things that added up, the things that didn't. She was still a stranger here, she knew that. But there was a difference between not having arrived yet and not being wanted, and what she'd heard in that store was unmistakably the latter. She thought about Harlan Voss and his buggy and the particular way he'd said what he'd said on the platform. She thought about the women in the store and the way they'd watched her boys walk out the door. She thought about the cut fence line and the word leverage, and what it meant that a man like that was watching and waiting for a mistake. She thought about Caleb's hands around the coffee cup, the way he'd said 5 more reasons. She got up before dawn and stoked the fire. Caleb found her in the kitchen when he came down, same as most mornings. He looked at her face and seemed to read something in it. Town? He asked. Town, she said. He sat down. Who? She told him. She kept it short and factual, which was the way she preferred to report things that had made her angry, because the anger was less useful than the information. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment with his hands flat on the table. I should have warned you, he said, about what you'd run into. It wouldn't have changed anything. No, he agreed, but still. Is it just women talking, or is it connected to Voss? He looked at her. Why do you ask that? Because you told me he's been watching for a mistake, and I'm thinking, for someone like that, we might look like a mistake. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise this time, something more like recognition. You figured that quick. I've had practice. She picked up her cup. A woman who's been starting over as many times as I have gets good at reading rooms. He was quiet again in that deliberate way he had. The 2 women you heard, one of them is Voss's wife's sister. She absorbed this. So it gets back to him. Everything in Red Hollow gets back to him eventually. He's been here 30 years and he's made sure of it. She set her cup down. The fire was crackling and the house was still quiet above them. The boys wouldn't be up for another half hour, maybe more. It was the kind of quiet that felt temporary and should be used. What's your plan? She asked him. For Voss? For all of it. The fence, the talk, the pressure he's going to keep putting on. Caleb looked at the table. Same plan I've had for 6 years, he said. Keep working. Don't give him anything to use. Build enough that he can't get leverage. And us? She asked. She said it plainly, because there was no useful way to say it otherwise. What are we in that plan? He met her eyes. You're not in the plan, he said. You are the plan. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she didn't try to do anything with it yet. She just noted it the way she noted everything, in that running ledger, and drank her coffee while the fire worked at the cold in the room. What neither of them knew, sitting at that kitchen table in the early dark, was that Harlan Voss had already begun the next stage of what he intended to do. 3 days later, a man named Eldridge came out to the ranch. He arrived in a good wagon with a leather satchel, dressed in the kind of clothes that signaled he worked indoors for a living. He introduced himself as a land assessor with the county office and said he needed to review the boundary markers on the north property line. Caleb stood in the yard and looked at the man for a long moment. My boundary markers were set 7 years ago, he said. They've been on file since. There's been a competing claim filed, Eldridge said. He opened his satchel, pulled out a document. I'm required to investigate. Who filed it? Eldridge glanced at the paper. A Mr. Harlan Voss of Red Hollow. Caleb took the document and read it. Mara was standing on the porch, and she watched his face while he read, looking for the reaction. What she saw was a jaw that set hard and eyes that stayed very still, which she'd come to understand was not the same as calm. He handed the document back. My deed is recorded at the county seat, he said. You're welcome to look at the markers. They haven't moved. I'll need to do that, Eldridge said. I'm required to record measurements. Then let's go. Caleb rode out with the assessor and 2 of his hands, and Mara stayed with the boys. Wyatt came and stood beside her on the porch after the wagon pulled away, watching the dust settle. Land claim? He asked. That's what the man said. Wyatt was quiet for a beat. Can Voss actually take it? I don't know, she said, which was honest. She didn't know land law in this county or this state, didn't know what a competing claim meant in practice, didn't know how much weight a man like Voss carried with the people who made those decisions. What do we do? Wyatt asked. She looked at him. Her oldest son, 16 years old, standing beside her on a porch that wasn't theirs yet, asking what they were going to do. She wanted to tell him this wasn't his problem, that he didn't have to carry it. She knew better than to say it. We figure out what we know, she said. Then we figure out what we can do with what we know. And in the meantime, we work. Wyatt nodded. Okay, she said. Caleb came back in the late afternoon, and he didn't say much about what the assessor had found, just that the markers were where they'd always been, and the man had recorded it, and that would have to be enough for now. He said it in the tone of a person who knows enough for now may not be enough in practice. That night after supper, while Cole and Milo were doing the dishes and Benji was already half asleep on the bench beside the stove, Caleb sat at the table and looked at the deed he'd pulled from a locked box in the back room. He spread it flat and read it in the lamplight, with the focused attention of a man looking for something he'd missed. Mara sat across from him and watched. After a while, she said, "What are you looking for?" Anything he could argue. He smoothed the edge of the document. Voss is smart. He doesn't do things that don't have a chance of working. So there's something. Maybe. He turned the document toward her and pointed to a line in the northeast corner description. This reference point. The survey used a creek bed marker. Creek beds move. She looked at the line. She wasn't a surveyor, but she understood what he was saying. By how much? Over 7 years? Possibly enough to argue. She sat back. What do you need? Old survey records, the original from when the land was filed. If the original shows the same line, the movement of the creek doesn't matter. The intent of the boundary is clear. He folded the deed. Those records would be at the county seat, which is 2 days' ride. Then go, she said. He looked at her. I can manage the ranch for 2 days, she said. Wyatt's capable. I'm capable. Go get what you need. He studied her face for a moment. You just got here, he said. I'd be leaving you. With 4 boys and a working house and a stoked chimney, she said. I've managed worse with less. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. I don't doubt that, he said. He left the next morning before the boys were up. Mara stood in the yard and watched the wagon go, and then she turned back to the house and looked at what was in front of her. Wyatt appeared at the barn door. "He's gone?" "2 days," she said. He nodded once. Then, "What do you need me to do?" She looked at the fence line, at the barn, at the cold gray sky overhead. 2 days. A ranch she'd lived in for less than 2 weeks. A man she'd known for less than that, whose land was being challenged by a man she already understood to be patient and systematic and unwilling to stop. "Everything," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen on him in a long time. "All right," he said, and went to work. The 2 days that followed were not simple. The weather turned sharp on the second afternoon, dropping fast enough that Mara had Cole and Milo bring the 2 youngest horses into the barn before dark. One of the hands, a lean, taciturn man named Perch, who'd worked for Caleb for 3 years and appeared to have decided on cautious neutrality toward the new household, came to tell her the water trough in the west pasture had frozen solid. She sent Wyatt. Milo went with him without being asked, which made something in her chest tighten briefly and then release, the way it did when her boys did something that reminded her they were still okay. Cole stayed in the barn with the horses. He'd found an old veterinary manual in the tack room and had been working through it with the focused intensity he brought to anything that genuinely interested him, stopping occasionally to feel along a leg or check an eye in the way the book described. Perch had come in once and watched him for a while without saying anything, then said, "Him," and gone back out, which from a man like Perch was practically a review. Benji mostly stayed close to Mara, which was unusual for him. He was by nature the boy most likely to vanish in the direction of something interesting and reappear an hour later, covered in something she'd rather not identify. But he'd been quieter since the first night, in a way she was monitoring without making it visible. On the second evening, while she was making supper, Benji climbed onto the bench at the table and folded his hands in front of him and said, "Mama, are we staying?" She turned from the stove. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we staying here?" He looked at the table. "Some of the boys at the creek today said we probably wouldn't." She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him, the same spot she'd taken across from Caleb. "What boys?" "I don't know their names. Town boys, I think. They came along the south fence." He picked at the edge of the table. "They said Harlan Voss was going to make sure we left." She was very still for a moment. "They said that exactly?" "More or less." He looked up at her. He was 6, and he had a 6-year-old's face, but his eyes were older than that in the specific way of children who have already been through a move and a loss and a train ride and an uncertain arrival. "Is he going to?" She looked at her youngest son across the table. The fire was going, the stove was going. Upstairs, Wyatt and Milo would be cold and tired when they came back from the water trough. Cole was in the barn, with a book he was taking more seriously than most grown men took their actual jobs. "No," she said. Benji looked at her. "He's not going to make us leave," she said. She meant it. She was not certain yet how to make it true, but the meaning of it was real. "This is where we are now, and where we are is where we stay." Benji nodded slowly. Then, "Okay." He climbed down from the bench and went toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To help Wyatt and Milo with the trough." "It's dark," she said. "I know where the lantern is." She watched him go. The door closed. The fire crackled. She turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with both hands on the counter and eyes closed, and let the heat from the iron work its way up through her palms. Caleb came back on the third morning, earlier than expected, and he came back with what he'd gone for. 2 survey documents from the county records office, original filings from when the land was first parceled. He spread them out on the kitchen table, while Mara stood opposite him and Cole appeared from nowhere and stood beside her, looking at the papers with the same attention he brought to the veterinary manual. The original survey was clear. The boundary ran along the historic creek bed position, marked by a specific outcropping of limestone that hadn't moved in 40 years and wasn't going to. Voss's claim depended on the creek's current position, which had shifted, but the original intent was documented and dated and signed by 2 witnesses who were both still alive. "Does this hold?" Mara asked. "It holds," Caleb said. "It'll take filing and probably a hearing, but it holds." "How long?" "Weeks, maybe more." She absorbed that. "What does he do in the meantime?" Caleb looked at her. Whatever he can. He rolled the survey carefully. But he's not going to get the land. Not this way. Cole was still looking at the table where the documents had been. He'll try something else, he said. Both of them looked at him. Cole looked back with the mildly surprised expression he got when he'd said something out loud that he'd intended only to think. You're probably right, Caleb said. He didn't say it dismissively. He said it like a man acknowledging a useful observation from a person worth listening to. Cole looked at him for a moment, then looked away, and the faintest color came into his face that Mara recognized as the physical evidence of something he hadn't let himself feel yet, being felt. What none of them said, because it didn't need to be said, was that they'd just spent 2 days managing a ranch together without him. That the trough had been cleared and the horses were in, and the supper had been made and the fence line had been checked, and the boys had been fed and the door had been held and the fire had been kept. What none of them said was that this was what it had looked like those 2 days, what it might continue to look like. Caleb looked at the kitchen around him, at the dishes from breakfast still drying on the rack, at the boot prints on the floor near the door, at the bench where Benji's coat was hanging crooked on its peg. He looked at it all, and something moved across his face that was too complicated to name quickly. He put the survey in the locked box in the back room. Mara went back to the stove. Outside, Milo was already in the yard doing something with a length of fencing wire. Wyatt was walking toward the barn with a bucket. The morning was cold and the sky was low and flat, with the particular look of weather building somewhere to the north. The land stretched out in all directions, flat and unyielding and demanding. Whatever Harlan Voss was going to try next, he hadn't tried it yet. That was not the same as it being over. Mara understood that. Caleb understood it. Even Wyatt, who still stood against walls sometimes and still watched with the careful eyes of a boy who'd learned caution the hard way, understood it. But the survey was in the box, the fire was going, the trough was cleared, and they were all still here. The hearing at the county seat was set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 weeks of waiting, and waiting had never been something the Dawson Ranch was built to accommodate. Caleb filed the counter documentation the same week he came back, rode the 2 days again with the original surveys in a leather tube strapped across his back, and returned with a receipt from the county clerk and the name of a land attorney in the valley who'd handled cases like this before. He told Mara about it at the kitchen table that evening in the same practical tone he used for everything, and she listened and asked 2 questions. How much would the attorney cost, and how solid was the case? And when he'd answered both, she nodded, and that was the end of the conversation on that subject for the night. What neither of them discussed was what Harlan Voss was likely doing during those same 6 weeks. Cole had said he'd try something else, and Cole was not wrong about things like that. The boy had a quality of attention that processed situations the way water found cracks, quietly, consistently, without announcing itself. Mara had watched it in him since he was small. He didn't predict things so much as notice the shape of how they were developing, the way a person who's been cold enough times starts to read weather before it arrives. Voss waited 11 days. Then he moved, and he moved where they hadn't been watching. It started with Perch. Perch had worked for Caleb for 3 years and had always been described, when described at all, as a solid hand. He did his work without complaint and without particular conversation. He'd shown cautious neutrality toward Mara and the boys, which she'd read as a reasonable response to a strange situation and had not pushed on. He helped Cole with the horses occasionally, not as a teaching exercise, but as someone who needed something done and had noticed the boy could be relied on to do it. On a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Caleb returned from the county seat, Perch came to find Caleb before breakfast and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and told him he was giving notice. Mara was in the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the conversation. She watched Caleb's posture, the particular stillness that meant something had registered, and watched Perch not quite meet his eyes, and she knew before Caleb came inside what had happened. Perch is leaving, Caleb said. She turned from the window. Voss? He sat down slowly. Offered him a foreman position. More money, steadier hours. He put his hat on the table. Can't blame the man. Can't you? He looked at her. He's got a family of his own, bills of his own. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. Voss knows what he's doing. He's not trying to take the man. He's trying to thin us out before the hearing. Who else? 2 other hands gave notice yesterday. I didn't know until Perch told me. He looked at the window. That's 3 out of 5. Mara set down the spoon she'd been holding. 3 out of 5 meant the daily work of the ranch, which was already operating at the outer edge of the manageable, was about to become genuinely difficult. It meant fence lines that needed regular riding would go unridden. It meant cattle that needed moving wouldn't get moved on time. It meant everything that held a ranch together would start to loosen, quietly, the way a rope frays before it breaks. "What do we do?" she asked. "Hire. But it takes time to find men worth having." He was quiet for a moment. "And in the meantime, we work with what we have," she said. He looked at her. "That's 4 people and 4 boys." "I'm aware of the math." Something crossed his face, not quite reluctance, more like the expression of a man who wants to say something protective and knows it will land wrong. He didn't say it. She appreciated that. She went to find Wyatt. She found him at the barn, already aware. Perch had apparently said something to him on the way out, some brief exchange she hadn't seen. Wyatt was standing with a saddle in his hands and an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. "I know," she said, before he could start. 3 men, he said. "Yes. Who's left?" "Caleb, you, me, and one hand named Russ, who apparently doesn't take outside offers on principle." She looked at her son. "And Milo, Cole, and Benji when they're not at lessons." Wyatt set the saddle down. "I can take the north fence." "I know you can." "Milo can do the water rounds in the morning if someone shows him the route." "I was thinking the same thing." He looked at her. "Cole's going to want to handle the horses himself." "Cole was already handling the horses himself," she said. A beat. Something relaxed in Wyatt's face by a fraction, the specific fraction that relaxed when he understood he wasn't being managed or redirected, when someone was just talking to him straight. "What about you?" he asked. "I'll do what needs doing," she said. He nodded. Then he picked the saddle back up. "I'll take the north fence today and map out where the weak sections are, so we know what to prioritize." "Good," she said. He was already moving toward the horse. What followed was 3 weeks that Mara would later think of, not as a crisis, but as a calibration, a painful, grinding recalibration of what everyone in the house was actually capable of when the situation stopped being manageable by comfortable margins. It stripped things down to function. It showed the boys and the man and the woman they were in a way that easier circumstances would have taken months to reveal. Wyatt turned out to have a natural sense for land management that Caleb said, one evening, was better than some grown men he'd hired. He said it once and didn't repeat it, which was how Wyatt seemed to prefer receiving things that mattered to him. Once, plainly, without ceremony. Mara watched her son absorb it and go back to eating his supper with the very slight change in his posture that meant something had landed. Milo's relationship with the morning water rounds began badly. The route covered 4 pastures and 2 creek crossings, and required keeping track of which troughs were gravity-fed and which needed pumping, and he got it wrong twice the first week, resulting in a pasture of thirsty cattle and one instance of Caleb having to ride out and correct it without making it a larger moment than it needed to be. Caleb explained the route again in the morning of the 3rd day, using a stick and a patch of flat dirt for a map, and Milo crouched over it and studied it with an intensity that was almost comical in a 9-year-old, and after that he didn't get it wrong again. He had a memory like a steel trap once something had been explained to him in terms he could picture, which was something Caleb had apparently figured out faster than most people did. Cole's contribution was the quietest and in some ways the most significant. He'd been moving through the veterinary manual steadily, cross-referencing what he read with what he was seeing in the animals every day, and what he was seeing was that 2 of the remaining horses had a respiratory issue developing, the kind of slow-building thing that was easy to miss until it became expensive to treat. He came to Caleb with his findings on a Wednesday evening, with the manual open to the relevant page and his own notes written in the margins in his small, precise handwriting. Caleb read it. He looked at the boy. He looked at the manual. Then he went to the barn with Cole and spent an hour examining the horses, asking questions, listening to the answers. He came back in and told Mara that Cole had probably saved him 2 horses and a significant amount of money. "Tell him that," she said. "I did," Caleb said. He paused. "He said he was just reading." "He always says that." Caleb looked at her with an expression that was becoming familiar, the one he got when something surprised him that he hadn't expected to be surprised by. She'd noticed he got it more often than she'd have predicted for a man who presented as largely unreadable. He wasn't unreadable, she'd learned. He just read slowly and deliberately and in a register that wasn't designed for quick impression. It was a Thursday in the fourth week of the three-handed operation when the first real break came, and it came from an unexpected direction. A man named Walt Gruber drove up to the ranch in a wagon that had seen considerable use and asked to speak to Caleb Dawson. He was a rancher from the south side of the valley, older than Caleb by maybe 15 years, with a face that had the texture of a man who'd spent those years outside, and a handshake that Mara, watching from the porch, could tell was serious from 20 feet away. She didn't go inside. She stayed where she was because the porch was where she happened to be, and she'd decided early on that she wasn't going to make a habit of disappearing when people came to talk to Caleb. She was part of this household. The sooner the surrounding county understood that, the less energy would be wasted on the question. Gruber spoke to Caleb in the yard for about 15 minutes. She caught pieces of it. The wind was wrong for hearing all of it, but she caught enough. Gruber's name had come up in a context she recognized. He was one of 3 other ranchers whose land abutted the Voss property at various points, and he'd had his own troubles over the years. Fence disputes, water rights, a legal action that had gone badly and then recovered when Voss overreached. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard the word coalition, and she heard Caleb say, "Not enough people," and she heard Gruber say, "More than you think." Caleb came to her on the porch after Gruber's wagon had gone. "He wants to organize," Caleb said. "I heard some of it," she said. "The other ranchers. 3 of them, including Gruber. Possibly a 4th. He leaned against the porch post. "Voss has been working on all of us, different methods for years. Gruber thinks if we present a unified record to the county commission, everything documented, laid out, it changes the nature of what the hearing looks like. From a property dispute to a pattern," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. That's smarter than fighting him one case at a time." "It is." He looked out at the yard. "It's also a lot of trust between men who've mostly kept their own counsel." "Does Gruber seem trustworthy?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He's been fighting Voss for 10 years and he's still standing," he said. "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." The coalition, as it became known in shorthand around the kitchen table, was not a fast thing to build. It required meetings, and meetings required travel, and travel required time that the ranch couldn't always spare. But Caleb began going to them, every other week, sometimes more, and what he came back with each time was incrementally more solid than what he'd left with. A signed statement from Gruber documenting a water rights manipulation from 4 years ago. A letter from a rancher named Hobart, who ran cattle on the far side of the valley, describing a fence line dispute that had the exact same fingerprints as the cut panels on Caleb's north boundary. A land survey discrepancy on a 4th property that matched the methodology Voss had used on the creek bed argument. Mara started keeping records. She hadn't been asked to do this. She'd simply noticed, after the second meeting, that Caleb was coming home with information that needed organizing, and that left to itself it would stay in his head and on loose papers in no particular order, which was not going to serve them in front of a county commission. She set up a system on the kitchen table using paper she'd found in the back room, and a method she'd developed over 2 years of keeping her household from going under. Methodical, dated, cross-referenced. Caleb came in one evening and found her at it, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before she heard him. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Since the Hobart letter," she said without looking up. He came to the table and stood beside her and looked at what she'd organized. He was quiet for long enough that she finally looked up. His expression was not one she'd seen before. It wasn't the surprise one. It was something quieter and harder to read, and she held it for a moment before returning to the paper in front of her. "You should have the attorney look at the sequence," she said. "The dates matter. If you can show the commission that the timing of his legal moves correlates with the rancher's renewal seasons, when they're most financially extended, it changes how it reads." A pause. "You figured that out?" "It's in the dates," she said. "Anyone who was looking would see it." "I've been looking at those dates for 6 years," he said. She looked up again. "You were looking for facts." "I was looking for a pattern." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me." She showed him. They sat at the table until well past 10 that night, long after the boys were asleep and the fire had burned down to the point where she had to get up twice to add wood, and what they built together in those hours was an argument, a real one, a documented one, the kind that could be laid in front of a county commission and followed from beginning to end without requiring anyone to take anything on faith. It was the first time she'd sat across from him at that table and felt, fully and without qualification, that they were working on the same thing, not parallel to each other. Together. She noticed it and said nothing about it. That was not the kind of thing you said. November arrived with a cold front that Caleb said was early by 2 weeks. The cattle needed moving to the winter pasture, which was a 2-day operation under normal circumstances, and was going to be closer to 3 with the reduced crew. Russ, the remaining hand, was capable and knew the terrain. Wyatt had been doing fence work for 2 months and knew the land well enough now to be genuinely useful. Caleb planned the drive for a Wednesday. On Tuesday night, Milo came downstairs well after everyone had gone to bed. Mara heard him because she was still awake herself. She'd been lying in the dark going through the documented timeline in her head, the way she'd taken to doing in the quiet hours, testing it for weaknesses. She heard the soft footfall on the stairs and waited. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks, squinting at the lamp she had burning low. "Can't sleep," he said. "Me either," she said. He came and sat at the table across from her, in Caleb's chair, which he always took when Caleb wasn't in it. He looked at the papers she had in front of her. "Is it bad?" he asked. She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he knew that things were difficult because 9-year-olds were not fooled by the versions of themselves adults presented, only by the explanations. "It's a fight," she said. "Not bad, just a fight." He was quiet for a moment. "Caleb's a good fighter?" She thought about how to answer that. "He's patient," she said. "Patient fighters usually do better in the end." Milo considered this with the focused gravity he brought to things that seemed important to him. "He showed me the water route again last week," he said, "even though I already knew it. He said it was just to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything." A pause. "I think he was checking if I'd learned it right, but he didn't want me to feel like I was being tested." Mara looked at her son. "What did you think of that?" Milo shrugged, in the way of a person who is not shrugging off the question but is thinking about how to answer it. "I thought it was pretty decent," he said. She almost smiled. "That's a good way to put it." He went back to bed 20 minutes later, and she sat with the lamp for a while longer, and the house settled around her in the way houses settle when everyone who lives in them is, at least for now, where they're supposed to be. The cattle drive went well until the second day, when it didn't. They'd moved about 2/3 of the herd to the winter pasture and were working the last section through the narrow corridor between the creek bed and the north fence when the horses started spooked. Not one of them, all of them, simultaneously, which meant whatever had startled them was significant enough to reach all their instincts at once. Caleb's horse went first, sidestepping hard and nearly unseating him. Wyatt's horse spun. Even Russ's horse, which was by reputation the steadiest animal on the property, began tossing its head and pulling sideways. The cattle, reading the horses the way cattle do, began to split. What followed was not a disaster, but was close to the edge of one. About 40 head breaking toward the creek, the rest milling and uncertain, Russ going after the split herd and Caleb and Wyatt trying to hold the main group. The creek bank was iced at the edges this time of year, and the cattle going down the slope toward it was a real possibility, which meant lost animals or injured ones or both. Mara was not on the drive. She was at the house. She would not know what happened until Caleb and Wyatt came in that evening, later than expected, with dried mud to their knees and the particular silence of people who have spent several hours managing something difficult and are too tired to narrate it yet. She put food on the table and waited. Wyatt ate without looking up. Caleb ate slowly, and she could see him replaying the day and the quality of his attention, even while he was doing other things. "How bad?" she asked, when enough time had passed. "We lost 2, Caleb said. "One went in the creek. We got her out, but she's—" He stopped. "She's not going to make it to spring." "And the other?" "Broken leg on the bank. Russ had to put her down." The table was quiet. "Was it Voss?" Wyatt asked. He said it flat, with no heat in it, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with heat. Caleb looked at him. "Don't know." "What scared the horses?" "Gunshot," Caleb said. "Far enough away that it could have been a hunter. Close enough that it couldn't have been an accident in terms of timing." He looked at his plate. "Can't prove it." "Can't prove it," Wyatt repeated slowly, with an inflection that was not quite sarcastic but was heading in that direction. Wyatt, Mara said. I'm not doing anything, he said. I know, she said. Keep it that way. He looked at her, and she held the look until he glanced away first. It wasn't discipline. What? It was the specific communication between them that they'd developed over 2 years of being each other's sounding board when there was no one else to be it. The look that said, I see what you're feeling, and I'm not going to pretend you don't have reason for it, and I still need you to stay steady. He picked up his fork and ate. Later, after the boys were in bed, Mara came back to the kitchen to find Caleb still at the table with his hands around a cup that had gone cold. She sat down. 2 animals, she said. 2 animals, he agreed. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Yes. She looked at the cold cup in his hands. He's escalating. He's getting nervous, Caleb said. The coalition spooked him. He knows we're building something. He finally set the cup down. Nervous men make mistakes. Or they get desperate, she said. He looked at her. Desperate men are more dangerous than comfortable ones, she said. I know that from experience. He was quiet for a long moment. What would you do? He asked. In the next 3 weeks. She hadn't expected him to ask it. She'd thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since Gruber's visit. But she hadn't expected him to turn the question toward her in that way, direct and without hedge, the way you'd ask someone you actually expected an answer from. She looked at the table. She thought about the documented timeline, about the pattern in the dates, about Gruber and Hobart, and the unnamed 4th rancher, and what they had collectively assembled. She thought about the land attorney and what Caleb had said the man needed to make the strongest case. She thought about what was still missing. There are people in town who know more than they've said, she said. People who've watched him do this for years and haven't said anything because the risk outweighed the reason. She looked up at Caleb. The balance has changed now. The coalition changes it. If there are 4 ranchers with documented grievances in front of a county commission, that's not a neighbor dispute. That's a record of conduct. The commission already knows his name, Caleb said. That's not enough. No, she agreed, but there are people who could make it more than enough if they decided to. She paused. Who in Red Hollow has Voss used and then discarded? Caleb looked at her for a moment. Why discarded? Because used and discarded people have nothing left to lose, she said, and nothing left to protect. Those are the people who talk. He was quiet again, turning something over. The assessor, he said finally. Eldridge. The man Voss sent out about the boundary. He's done that work for Voss 4 times in 6 years, on 4 different ranches. He leaned forward slightly. And last spring, Voss cut his fee in half when Eldridge tried to renegotiate. So he's resentful. He's resentful, Caleb confirmed. And he's got records. She said nothing. She let that sit in the space between them. He won't want to come forward, Caleb said. No, she said. But he won't have to come forward all the way. He just has to answer questions in front of a commission, with documentation, on the record. Caleb was looking at her with the expression that was not quite surprise, the one she was starting to recognize as the face he made when something reorganized itself in his thinking. I've been fighting Voss for 6 years, he said. On my own, mostly. Just holding on. I know, she said. I didn't know there was another way to fight. She looked at him across the table. There's always another way, she said. You just sometimes need someone who's been run out of enough places to stop thinking there's only one option. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the table, and she could see him working through it. And she let him, because Caleb Dawson was not a man who could be rushed through decisions without losing something in the rushing. I'll go see Eldridge, he said. Let me come, she said. He looked up. He'll talk more with a woman in the room, she said. Men like Eldridge, careful men, quiet men, men who've been used and are angry about it but don't trust anger. They talk differently when there's a woman present. It's something about the shame, she paused. Not my observation. Just something I've noticed. He considered this. You've done this before. Something like it, she said. When we lost the farm, there was a man at the bank who'd been pressured by the same creditor who'd pressured us. I needed him to tell the bank manager what he knew. I brought Wyatt. She paused. Wyatt was 14 and he just stood there being quiet. But something about having the boy in the room... She stopped. It didn't save the farm. But Wyatt standing there in that office made the man say what he knew, Caleb looked at her for a long moment. 14, he said. Yes. You had a 14-year-old running that kind of errand. I was doing what I had to do, she said, without apology, without performing the absence of it, just stating a fact. He nodded slowly. We'll go together, he said. Thursday. She nodded. She went to bed not long after, and she lay in the dark and looked at the low ceiling and thought about Wyatt at 14 in a bank office, standing straight and not saying anything, and how the man behind the desk had looked at him and something had shifted. Not enough. It hadn't been enough that time. This time, she thought, this time it would be. She was not certain of that, but she needed to be close enough to certain to act like it, because the alternative, sitting with the uncertainty and letting it stop her, wasn't something she'd allowed herself in 2 years. She'd learned that certainty was mostly a performance you gave yourself early in the morning before the day gave you reasons to doubt it. Outside, the wind was building from the north again. The same north the cattle drive had come from, the same direction Voss's property ran. Somewhere in the dark of the ranch, one of the horses moved in the barn. Cole would check them in the morning. He'd been checking them every morning for 6 weeks, and he hadn't missed a thing. Mara closed her eyes. 3 weeks until the hearing. 3 weeks of Harlan Voss growing more nervous, and nervous men doing what nervous men did. She thought about Eldridge and his half-cut fee and his records, and the particular anger of a careful man who'd been treated carelessly. She thought about Thursday. She let the dark come down over her thinking, and for the first time in a long time, she slept before she'd finished worrying. Eldridge lived on the east edge of Red Hollow in a house that was neither large nor small, but had the particular quality of a place maintained by someone who cared about order and had stopped caring about impression. The fence was straight, the yard was clear. The paint on the front door was old, but not peeling. A man who paid attention to the things that mattered to him and had drawn a clear line around what those things were. Mara noticed all of this from the wagon before they stopped. Caleb tied off the horse, and they walked to the door together. He knocked. She stood slightly behind him and to the left, which was where she'd decided to position herself. Present, but not leading. Visible, but not demanding. She'd thought about this on the ride over. How a man like Eldridge would read their arrival. What he'd need to see to feel like the conversation was something he could control. The door opened after a longer wait than was natural. Eldridge was a lean man in his 50s with careful eyes and the posture of someone who'd spent years hunching over documents and had developed a permanent slight forward tilt to his shoulders. He looked at Caleb first, then at Mara, and then back at Caleb with an expression that was not welcoming but was not hostile. More like a man calculating the cost of a thing before agreeing to hear the price. Dawson, he said. Eldridge, Caleb said. Can we come in? A pause. Eldridge looked at Mara again. She met his eyes without performing anything. No warmth, no pressure, just presence. 5 minutes, Eldridge said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the house matched the outside. Ordered, spare, a man living alone in a way that had settled into habit. There was a desk in the front room with papers on it in neat stacks, and Eldridge moved to stand near it the way people stand near things they trust. He didn't offer chairs. Mara sat down in one anyway, not aggressively, just as a woman who'd been in a wagon for an hour and saw no reason to stand. After a brief pause, Caleb sat in the other. Eldridge remained standing. What do you want? I want to talk about the boundary assessment you did on my north pasture, Caleb said. That assessment was conducted according to proper procedure. I'm not saying it wasn't. Then what are you saying? Caleb looked at him steadily. I'm saying you've done 4 assessments on 4 different ranches in this valley in 6 years, all of them on land that borders Harlan Voss's property, all of them initiated by a competing claim filed by Voss. He paused. And last spring he cut your fee. Something moved in Eldridge's face, small and fast, but Mara caught it. My fee arrangements with clients are not your business, Eldridge said. No, Caleb agreed. They're not. He leaned forward slightly. But the pattern of those assessments is going to be relevant to a county commission in 3 weeks, and how that pattern gets presented is going to depend a lot on who presents it first. Eldridge was quiet. He looked at the desk, at his ordered stacks of paper, and Mara understood the look. It was a man seeing something he'd been careful to ignore shifting into visibility. She spoke for the first time. Mr. Eldridge. Her voice was even. How many of those 4 ranches are still fighting Voss? He looked at her. 3 of them, she said. We've spoken to all 3. And what's consistent across every one of their situations is the same methodology, the same timing, and the same assessor. She let that settle for a moment. We're not here to accuse you of anything. We're here because you're the only person in Red Hollow who has documentation of every stage of what Voss has done. And because you know better than anyone in this valley what that documentation actually shows. Eldridge's jaw was tight. Getting involved in a commission hearing is not something I'm in a position to do. Why not? Mara asked. Because I depend on work from this county. And if Voss already cut your fee, she said. Quietly. Not unkindly. He already showed you what your cooperation is worth to him. The silence that followed was the kind that meant something was happening inside it. Eldridge sat down. Not in a chair. On the edge of his desk, which shifted the room slightly, made it less formal. He rubbed one hand across his mouth. The creek bed argument he's using on your property, he said, addressing Caleb. He used the same basis on the Hobart property 2 years ago. Different creek, same methodology. The commission rejected it. I know, Caleb said. What you may not know, Eldridge said slowly, is that the survey he submitted for the Hobart claim had a discrepancy in the baseline measurement, a significant one. I flagged it in my internal notes. Voss told me to refile without the flag. He paused. I should have refused. The room was very quiet. Did you? Mara asked. No, Eldridge said. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying for 2 years, not with relief exactly, but with the specific exhaustion of something that's been held too long. I refiled. The commission rejected it anyway because the limestone marker was clear, but the baseline discrepancy, it was never part of the official record. But you kept your internal notes, Mara said. He looked at her. I keep everything. Would you let the commission see them? Another silence. Longer this time. Eldridge looked at the stacks of paper on his desk, and Mara watched him, and she did not push. She'd learned that the moments when you most wanted to push were the moments when pushing would ruin everything. You had to let a person arrive at the thing themselves, in their own time, at whatever pace their particular brand of courage could manage. Eldridge looked up. I want it on record that I raised the flag internally, he said. That's all I'm asking, that the commission understands I documented the discrepancy. That's all we're asking too, Caleb said. Eldridge nodded once with the expression of a man who'd made a decision he couldn't unmake and was choosing not to think about whether it was the right one yet. They left his house 20 minutes later. Caleb helped Mara up to the wagon seat without comment, and she let him, and they drove back toward the ranch in a silence that was different from the silence on the way there. You knew he had those notes, Caleb said. Not accusing, just observing. I suspected, she said. Men like Eldridge, they protect themselves. They keep records because records are the kind of safety a careful man can make. You've known men like Eldridge. I've been in rooms with men like Eldridge, she said, when everything we had was being pulled out from under us. You learn to read the kind of man who knows things and has decided the knowing is too dangerous to share. She looked at the road ahead. The trick is figuring out what changed the calculation. Voss changing his fee. That, she said, and probably 6 years of watching what he's been doing from the inside. Caleb drove for a while without speaking. The road back to the ranch was empty this time of day, and the valley spread out on both sides of them with the particular bleak beauty of late November. Brown grass, bare trees, the mountains in the far distance holding the first of the season's real snow. You're good at this, he said. She looked at him. At what? Knowing what people need to hear, how to get them to the place they were already going. She thought about that for a moment. I've had to be, she said. He nodded, kept driving. She looked at the mountains. It was not a comfortable thought, that her competence at navigating difficult people in difficult rooms was built entirely on years of having no other option, that what looked like skill was mostly just accumulated necessity. She didn't say this to Caleb. She just sat with it the way she sat with most things that were true and complicated and didn't need an audience. The week before the hearing was the longest week. Not because nothing happened, a great deal happened, but because everything that happened was the grinding, administrative, exhausting kind of thing that produced no visible forward movement and required constant attention anyway. Caleb rode to meet with the land attorney twice. Mara organized and reorganized the documented timeline until every date and correlation was as clear as she could make it. Gruber sent a writer with a signed affidavit from the fourth rancher, a man named Clemens, who'd been fighting a water rights issue with Voss for 3 years and had finally agreed, after 2 conversations with Gruber and 1 letter from the attorney, to submit his documentation to the commission. Eldridge sent his internal notes by post 3 days before the hearing. They arrived in a sealed envelope addressed to the attorney and were, according to what the attorney told Caleb by letter, exactly as useful as Mara had hoped they would be. The boys felt the tension in the house without being told to. Benji grew quieter. Milo threw himself into the morning water rounds with the energy of a child who understood that doing his job better than was required was the only available form of help. Cole spent an entire afternoon in the barn reorganizing the tack room in a way that served no immediate purpose but needed doing eventually, which was his way of being useful when there was nothing specific to do. Wyatt came to Mara on the 4th night of that week and sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "Is there anything I can do that you haven't thought of?" She looked at her son, 16 years old, with his father's jaw and his own particular eyes, and 2 years of growing up faster than anyone should have to sitting on him, like weight he'd learned to carry without bending. "Not right now," she said. "Then just tell me what's going to happen at the hearing." She told him. Not a simplified version, the actual version. The 4 ranchers, the documented pattern, Eldridge's notes, the attorney's argument about the baseline discrepancy. She told him about the limestone marker and why it mattered. She told him what the commission could do if they agreed with the evidence and what they couldn't do even if they did. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which was how she knew he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of conversation for a long time. "If it goes wrong," he said, "then we document that too and appeal," she said, "and we keep working. Voss doesn't stop." "No," she said, "but neither do we." He looked at the table for a moment, then up at her. "You really believe that?" She held his gaze. "I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't." He pushed back from the table and stood up. "All right," he said, and went to bed. She stayed at the table after he went up, with the lamp and the papers and the quiet of the sleeping house, and allowed herself 2 full minutes of being terrified before she put it away and went back to the work. The morning of the hearing, Caleb came downstairs to find the kitchen already lit and Mara at the stove and all 4 boys at the table in various states of readiness. This was not a thing they'd planned. Nobody had told the boys the hearing was today, or that it would matter, or that things might be different when the day was over. But they were at the table, all 4 of them, eating without being asked, dressed without being told. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at this scene for a moment before he moved. Mara turned from the stove and caught the expression on his face and looked away again quickly, because it was not a look meant to be witnessed. She put his plate down and went to check on the biscuits and did not say anything. Benji looked up from his plate. "Are you going to win today?" he asked Caleb. Caleb sat down. He picked up his fork. "Working on it," he said. Benji accepted this with the same pragmatic gravity with which he seemed to accept most things, and went back to his breakfast. The county seat was 4 hours' ride. Caleb left after breakfast with Russ driving the wagon, carrying the leather tube with the surveys and the attorney's file and Mara's organized timeline. She stayed at the ranch. She'd thought about this carefully, whether to go, what her presence would add or complicate, and she'd decided that what she needed to do that day was be here. Keep the ranch running, keep the boys steady, be the thing that was still standing regardless of the outcome, because if she went and it went badly, she'd have nothing to come home to but her own reaction, and she needed the house and the boys to come home to. She did not feel good about staying, but she felt certain it was right. The day was one of the hardest she'd spent at the ranch, and she'd spent some hard ones. She worked through the morning on the things that needed doing. She helped Milo with the water rounds. She helped Cole turn out 2 of the horses who'd been stalled for 3 days and needed movement. She fixed the porch railing that had been pulling loose from its post for 2 weeks. She made a stew that simmered all afternoon and was ready when people needed it. She did not check the road toward town more than was reasonable. Wyatt checked it for her. She noticed this and said nothing. At 3 in the afternoon, Benji climbed up on the fence post at the edge of the yard. The post he'd claimed as his lookout position in the first week and had been using ever since, and announced that he could see a wagon on the road. Mara walked to the fence. She stood beside Benji's post and looked. The wagon was moving at a normal pace, not hurrying. That told her nothing. Caleb was not the kind of man who hurried for good news or bad. She waited. Russ brought the wagon into the yard, and Caleb stepped down with the leather tube under his arm and looked at her. His face was not, as she'd feared, the closed-down, too quiet face of a man absorbing defeat. But it was not uncomplicated. "Tell me," she said. "Commission ruled in our favor on the boundary claim," he said. "The limestone marker evidence was solid. Eldridge's notes documented the baseline discrepancy on the Hobart precedent, which undermined Voss's methodology entirely." She exhaled once. "And?" "Gruber's affidavit and Hobart's documentation are now part of the commission record. Clemens' water rights issue was referred for its own hearing, but with the full context included." He paused. The commission chair asked the attorney whether there were additional grievances in the valley that hadn't yet been documented. "What did the attorney say?" "That he'd be in touch." She looked at Caleb, at the leather tube, at the yard behind him where 3 of her boys had materialized in the last 30 seconds. "What does that mean?" "It means the commission is interested in looking at Voss more broadly," he said. "It means this wasn't just a ruling on my fence line. It was the beginning of something bigger." She absorbed this. The beginning of something bigger meant more hearings, more documentation, more weeks like the one she'd just lived through. "Okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Okay?" "I said what I meant," she said. "Okay." Something that might have been relief, or might have been something else, moved across his face and settled. He handed Russ the reins and came through the yard gate, and Milo immediately appeared at his elbow, asking questions that Caleb answered while walking, and Benji jumped down from the fence post and attached himself to his other side. And by the time they reached the porch, Caleb had 2 boys accompanying him, and the beginnings of a conversation about whether winning a hearing meant they could get a dog now. Mara followed at a short distance. She let herself have the moment without analyzing it, which was not something she did often. The cold air, the wagon in the yard, the low sun cutting across the November grass. Her boys moving around this man with the particular ease of people who'd stopped calculating their proximity. She let herself have it for about 15 seconds. Then she went inside to check the stew. The days after the hearing settled into something new, which was not ease. Ease was not really available in the particular life they were living, but was something closer to footing. The ground under them was still uncertain, and Voss was still a presence in the valley, and would be for as long as he had land and money and the patience his kind of man had. But the nature of the uncertainty had changed. They were no longer just holding on. They were in a position, the attorney said, from which they could act. Caleb began this process of replacing the 3 hands he'd lost to Voss. It took longer than he wanted, and the men he found were not as experienced as he wanted, but they were willing and they learned fast. And Wyatt, who had been quietly absorbing everything about the operation for 3 months now, turned out to be an efficient and unsentimental trainer. He showed the new men the fence routes and the water rounds and the cattle management with the same directness he brought to everything, and if he corrected them when they got it wrong, he also acknowledged when they got it right, which Mara noticed was something he'd learned somewhere in the last 3 months. She thought she knew where. Cole's work with the horses had by this point become something the whole ranch depended on in a quiet, structural way. The 2 horses he'd flagged early had recovered fully. He'd caught a third with a different issue, a hoof problem that was early enough to treat without consequence. And the horse population was, according to Russ, in better overall condition than it had been in 2 years. Russ said this once, standing in the barn, to no one in particular. Cole was there and didn't respond, but his back got slightly straighter, which was the Cole version of a reaction. Milo had made the morning water round entirely his own. He'd started keeping a daily log, his idea, documented in a small notebook he'd found somewhere, noting which troughs needed attention, which animals seemed off, what the conditions were in each pasture. He presented it to Caleb one evening without announcing that he'd been doing it, just slid it across the table during supper and said, "I've been keeping track." Caleb had read the whole thing right there at the table while the food was getting cold. And when he looked up, he said, "This is good work." And Milo said, "I know," and went back to eating, and Mara had to look at the window for a moment. Benji, who was 6 and whose contribution to the ranch was mostly logistical chaos and very loud questions, had nonetheless attached himself to the project of finding what Caleb called the right dog, with a commitment that exceeded all reasonable expectation for a 6-year-old. He'd interviewed, there was no other word for it, every person who came to the ranch about what kind of dog was best for cattle work, had rejected 3 separate suggestions on grounds that were not always logical, but were always delivered with complete conviction, and had narrowed his requirements to a working dog, large enough to be useful, that did not bark at night for no reason, because the barking kept him awake. Caleb had said this was a reasonable requirement for a working dog. Benji had said he knew. The first week of December brought a cold that was different from the November cold, deeper, more settled, the kind that moved in and intended to stay. Caleb said January would be hard, and February harder, which was his assessment of most things. Factual, unembellished, not designed to comfort, but also not designed to alarm. Mara had been watching the weather too, and the wood supply, and the food stores. She'd made a quiet inventory in November and had not liked all of what she found, and had been steadily adding to the less satisfactory columns in ways she didn't announce. She'd taken over management of the household accounts from the loose arrangement Caleb had been using, not because he was incompetent, she understood quickly, but because he was a man who was very good at the ranch and had simply never had someone who was equally good at the house, and the result was a functional but inefficient system that leaked in several places. She fixed the leaks without making an event of it. She wasn't performing competence, she was just doing what needed doing. Caleb noticed anyway. He noticed in the way he noticed most things, without ceremony, and then said something about it once, plainly. "The accounts are cleaner," he said one evening, looking at the household ledger she'd reorganized. "They were fine," she said, "just inefficient." "I know." He closed the ledger. "I've been meaning to fix it for 2 years. It's fixed now." He looked at her. "I know that too." She looked back at him and held the look for a moment. And in that moment something passed between them that was not words and not a gesture, but was real enough that she felt it, and knew from his expression that he felt it. And neither of them said anything about it, because saying something about it was not the right move, and both of them understood that instinctively. She turned back to what she'd been doing. He went out to check the barn. The thing that hadn't been said sat in the kitchen between the lamp and the stove and the neatly organized ledger, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the part she turned over later, lying in the dark with the ceiling above her. That it hadn't been uncomfortable. That they'd both looked at it and looked away from it and moved on to the next thing without any of the awkwardness that should have been there. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it the same place she filed everything. In the ledger she kept in her head, the one that was always running, and let it sit until she knew what it meant. The second week of December, Voss made his next move. It came not through a legal mechanism this time, but through the town, which should not have surprised her but caught her somewhat off guard because the hearing had seemed to draw a line, and she'd let herself believe briefly that he would respect it. He didn't. What she'd said to Caleb about desperate men was proving accurate. The commission ruling hadn't stopped him. It had redirected him. What he did was this. He let it be known, through the particular network of people and relationships he'd spent 30 years cultivating in Red Hollow, that the Dawson Ranch's new arrangement was not going to last. He didn't threaten. He didn't do anything that could be documented. He simply made it a fact in the social air of the town, the way certain men were able to make things facts before they'd happened, just by the weight of their certainty. He told people, the mill workers, the feed store owner, the women at the dry goods store who'd watched Mara and her boys leave without warmth, that the Dawson situation was temporary, that Caleb had made an error in judgment that he'd eventually correct. He said it about Mara. He said it about the boys. And the way he said it made it clear that he wasn't just predicting, he was planning. Mara found out on a Tuesday when she went to the dry goods store, and the woman behind the counter was not merely brittle in her politeness, but was something closer to pitying, which was worse. Pitying meant she believed what she'd heard. It meant the information had been delivered convincingly enough to produce certainty in a woman who barely knew the situation. Mara bought what she'd come for and left. She drove the wagon back to the ranch with both hands tight on the reins and worked through it while she drove. What it meant. What it required. She pulled into the yard and Wyatt was there, and he looked at her face as she got down and said, "What happened?" "Voss is talking," she said. "In town. About us? Wyatt's jaw set. Saying what? That we won't last. She handed him the reins. That Caleb made a mistake. Wyatt stood holding the reins with an expression she recognized, the one that was a wall over something she didn't want to see in her son's face. What do we do? She looked at the house, at the yard, at the fence line running away to the north where 3 months ago there had been cut panels that could have meant the end of all of this before it started. We do what we've been doing, she said. We work. We build. She paused. And we stop letting him define the terms of the question. Wyatt looked at her. What does that mean? It means we stop fighting him from a defensive position, she said. We've been responding to what he does. Every time he moves, we react. She took the paper bags from the wagon. It's time to move first. How? She thought about the attorney's letter, the commission chair's question, the phrase additional grievances in the valley. There are people in this town who've watched Voss do this for 30 years and have been waiting for someone to organize long enough and convincingly enough to make it safe to say something. She turned toward the house. We've been organizing with 4 ranchers. I think it's time to find out how many people in Red Hollow itself are ready to say out loud what they already know. Wyatt was quiet behind her. She heard him tie off the horse. Mama. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the wall, not the careful watching. Something more open than that, and because it was open, it was harder to look at. Back on the train, he said. When you said you weren't sure of anything, did you think it would end up like this? She held his gaze. No, she said honestly. I thought it would be hard. I thought we'd have to fight. I didn't know who we'd be fighting or what we'd have when we were doing it. Are you glad you came? She looked at her son, at the house behind him, at the yard and the fence line and the smoke from the chimney and the barn where one of her boys was, right now, checking horses with the focus of someone who'd found the thing he was supposed to be doing. Yes, she said. He nodded. Something in his face settled into a quieter configuration. So am I, he said, and went to put the horse up. She stood in the yard for a moment longer. The cold was sharp and the light was going fast, the way it did in December, dropping the temperature with it. Somewhere across the north pasture, on the land that was still and would remain Caleb's, a hawk was working the updrafts above the tree line. She watched it for a moment, that patient, efficient circling, before she turned toward the house. There was supper to make. There was a plan to form. There were 4 boys inside and a man who'd be back from the far pasture before dark, who would sit at the table with the expression that meant he was listening for what she'd found out today, and to whom she would tell it plainly without softening it, because that was the only way they'd ever been with each other. And it was, she had come to understand, one of the best things about the life she was building here. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. Cole's coat was on its hook. Benji's boot was in the middle of the floor where someone would trip on it. Milo's notebook was on the table corner, open to the latest entry. She hung her coat, moved Benji's boot to where it belonged, and put the kettle on. Outside, the hawk was still working the updrafts, patient and unhurried, waiting for what the land would give. The plan Mara described to Caleb that evening was not complicated. That was the thing about plans that actually worked, she'd learned. They were almost never complicated. They were just clear about what they needed and honest about what they were asking. She told him over supper, after the boys had eaten and Benji had been sent up to bed, and Milo had gone to update his notebook, and Cole had disappeared back to the barn for one last check on the horses. Wyatt stayed at the table because she'd decided that Wyatt had earned the right to be in this conversation, and Caleb had not objected. Voss is talking in town, she said. Not with documents, not through lawyers. He's doing it socially, the way he does everything when the legal route closes off, making it a fact before it is won. Caleb looked at his plate. I know. You've heard? Russ told me this afternoon. He set his fork down. He's saying I've made an error in judgment, that the household arrangement is temporary. He's saying it about us specifically, she said, about me and the boys. Caleb's expression was the still one. Yes, he said, I know that too. She looked at him. And I'm angry about it, he said plainly, but anger doesn't fix it. No, she agreed, but what fixes it is what I want to talk about. She turned to Wyatt briefly, then back to Caleb. We've been building a legal case. Ranchers, documentation, the commission. That's working, and we need to keep it working. But Voss isn't fighting us legally anymore. He's fighting us socially, and you can't answer a social campaign with a survey document. Caleb looked at her. What do you answer it with? With people, she said. There are people in Red Hollow who have watched him operate for 30 years. Shopkeepers, former employees. People. He's pressured in ways that never became legal matters because they weren't about land. They were about supply arrangements, about mill pricing, about the small daily mechanics of how a man with that much money and that much patience makes everyone around him just uncomfortable enough to stay in line. She paused. Those people have been quiet because nobody organized long enough and convincingly enough to make speaking safe. The commission ruling changes that. Eldridge changes that. 4 ranchers with a documented record changes that. You want to go to them, Caleb said. I want us to go to them, she said, not as a legal exercise, not with paperwork, just conversations. The kind where you sit across from someone and tell them what you know and ask them what they know and let them decide what they want to do with it. That's a lot of conversations, Wyatt said from his end of the table. Yes, Mara said. It is. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table, and she could see him measuring it. The time, the energy, the uncertain return on an investment that had no guarantee attached to it. He was a man who thought about what things cost before he committed to them, which she'd come to understand was not caution for its own sake, but the practical accounting of someone who'd been running a large operation alone for too long. The feed store owner, Caleb said finally. His name is Tatum. Voss has been pressuring him on pricing for 2 years. He mentioned it to me once and then never again. Then Tatum first, she said. Wyatt looked between them. When? This week, Mara said. She looked at Caleb. If that works for you. He met her eyes. It works. Tatum turned out to be exactly the kind of man she'd described to Caleb, someone who'd been quietly angry for long enough that the anger had calcified into a kind of permanent low-grade resentment he'd stopped expecting to do anything about. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who ran a clean shop and was precise about his inventory and had a streak of fundamental fairness that Voss had been grinding against for 2 years by using his purchasing volume to force below-cost pricing on certain goods, knowing Tatum couldn't afford to lose the mill's account. They went on a Wednesday. Mara, Caleb, and, at Mara's suggestion, Cole, who came because he needed supplies for the barn and said so, and sat quietly in the corner of the shop looking at harness hardware while the adults talked, and whose presence, as Mara had predicted, altered the quality of the room in a way that was hard to define and easy to feel. Tatum talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the pricing pressure and about 2 other shopkeepers on the main street who'd experienced similar arrangements, about a man who'd once tried to organize a merchant complaint and had suddenly found himself unable to get supplies from 3 different distributors that Voss had relationships with. He talked about 30 years of watching a man accumulate the kind of influence that made other people's options smaller without ever doing anything obviously illegal. He didn't commit to anything specific when they left. But he shook Caleb's hand and looked at Mara with an expression that was different from what she'd seen in the dry goods store. And when Cole said goodbye on the way out, just a simple, quiet goodbye, Tatum looked at the boy for a moment and nodded in a way that was more than a farewell. In the wagon on the way home, Cole said, He's going to help. Caleb looked at him. You think so? He just needed to say it out loud to someone, Cole said. He's been saying it to himself for 2 years. Mara looked at her son and then at the road and did not say anything because there was nothing to add. Over the next 2 weeks, they had 9 more conversations. Some went like Tatum's. Some went worse. One man shut his door before they'd gotten through the second sentence, and she filed that away without taking it personally because not every person was ready and not every person needed to be. What she was building was not unanimity. She was building a visible mass, enough voices, enough names, enough documented experience that what Voss was doing in Red Hollow stopped looking like business and started looking like a system. The second commission hearing was scheduled for January, and this time it was not about Caleb's fence line. It was about Harlan Voss's conduct across the valley, brought by the attorney on behalf of 4 ranchers and supported by documentary submissions from Eldridge, affidavits from 2 former Voss employees who'd been quietly located by Gruber, and in the end, a letter signed by 7 Red Hollow merchants describing a consistent pattern of commercial pressure that had been maintained over a period of no less than 8 years. Tatum organized the letter. He'd called it, in the note he sent to Mara, along with the signed copy, a long time coming. She read the note twice and put it in the file. January in the valley was exactly as hard as Caleb had said. The cold was serious, and the work it created was constant. Livestock to manage, water lines to keep from freezing, fences to check after every hard wind. The boys worked without complaint, which was not the same as working without difficulty. Milo's hands were constantly cold, and he had developed a cough that Mara watched with the monitoring attention of a woman who'd managed enough winters to know the difference between a nuisance cough and a dangerous one. She kept him warm and made him drink broth in the evenings, and the cough stayed a nuisance. Cole wore through a pair of gloves, and Mara repaired them twice before accepting they were gone and cutting up an old coat to make new ones, which were ugly and functional, and which Cole wore without comment. Wyatt pulled a muscle in his shoulder during a fence repair and worked through it without telling anyone, which Mara found out about from Russ, and which led to the one real argument she and Wyatt had that winter. Short and sharp, and ending with him admitting she was right and her admitting she'd said it harder than she needed to. Benji got his dog in the first week of January. It came from a rancher down the valley who had a working litter and had heard, through the particular grapevine of the valley, that the Dawson place was looking. The dog was a large, black and tan cattle dog, not beautiful, but extremely purposeful, with the steady eyes of an animal that knew what it was for. Benji named him Marker, on grounds that were never fully explained but seemed to involve the dog's tendency to sit in significant locations and observe things, which Benji appeared to consider a virtue. Marker did not bark at night for no reason. Benji was satisfied. The January commission hearing lasted 2 days. Caleb attended both days, with the attorney and Gruber and Hobart and Clemens. Mara stayed at the ranch both days, and both days were the kind of slow, grinding wait that had no grace to it, just the work and the boys and the fire and the hours moving at the pace hours moved when you needed them to go faster. On the evening of the second day, Caleb came home after dark. Mara was at the table. She'd told herself she would not be waiting at the window, and she hadn't been. She'd been at the table, which was different. Wyatt and Cole were in the kitchen too, supposedly doing other things, and Milo was on the stairs, which he'd claimed was because he was going to bed and just happened to be doing it slowly. Caleb came through the door and took his coat off and hung it and turned around. She looked at his face. He looked tired in the way of a man who has been tightly wound for several hours and has just been allowed to let it go. His jaw was loose. His eyes were not light exactly, but something closer to light than she'd seen in them in 2 months. The commission found in favor of the full complaint, he said, all 4 ranches. The creek bed argument is permanently dismissed. The methodology Voss used on the Hobart precedent was formally noted as improper. His mill and land operations are going to be reviewed by the county for any further violations of commercial fairness statutes. The kitchen was very quiet. The merchant letter was entered into the record, he said. The commission chair read it into testimony himself. Mara's hands were flat on the table. She pressed them down and breathed once. "It's done?" Wyatt said from his chair. "The immediate fight," Caleb said. "Voss isn't going anywhere. He still has his land and his money and his personality." He looked at Wyatt directly. "But he's operating now in front of a commission that has documented everything he's done. That changes what he can try." "It changes the cost," Mara said. "Yes," Caleb said. "It makes the cost too high for a man who's been careful about that calculation for 30 years. Milo came fully down the stairs. Benji appeared from wherever Benji had been, the landing above, by the sound of his footsteps coming fast. Marker came in from the back corner where he'd been watching things in his observational way. It was not a celebratory moment in the grand, clean sense of the word. Nobody cheered. There was no grand gesture. Caleb sat down because he was tired, and Mara got up to put the kettle on because there was always something practical to do, and doing it gave her hands something that wasn't the surface of the table, and Benji asked if winning meant they could get a second dog, and Cole told him that 1 dog was already a stretch, and Benji said he disagreed. The kitchen was full of noise, which was the realist version of the thing. What followed was not an ending but a reorganization. The valley around Red Hollow did not transform overnight. Voss did not leave or collapse or become a different man. He was still there, still owned what he owned, still had the personality of a man who'd spent 30 years getting what he wanted and wasn't constitutionally capable of finding that unreasonable. But the terms had changed. He could feel them change, and the people around him could feel it, and that feeling was, in practice, what mattered. Tatum started stocking his shelves at his own pricing. The shopkeeper who'd organized the merchant letter hung it, framed, behind his counter, which was either a statement or a decoration depending on how you read it, and probably both. Gruber came out to the ranch in February with a bottle of whiskey and the information that Clemens' water rights hearing had also been resolved in his favor. He sat at the kitchen table and talked with Caleb for 2 hours, and at the end of it there was an informal agreement between them to formalize the coalition. Not as a legal body, but as a standing arrangement, ranchers in the valley sharing information and documentation and the accumulated knowledge of what Voss had tried and how it had been answered. A record, ongoing, that didn't depend on any one person's memory. Mara organized the first meeting. She wrote the invitations, set the date, and made enough food for 12 people, which she'd guessed would come, and 17 did. Spring arrived with the particular stubbornness of spring in that part of the world. Not a grand arrival, but a gradual, grudging concession from the cold, a degree at a time, the grass coming back in patches before it came back fully, the days lengthening in increments. The ranch responded to spring the way it always had, with 100 simultaneous demands that couldn't be prioritized, only managed. By March, Wyatt was managing the North Fence operations largely on his own, with 2 of the newer hands under him in a working arrangement that nobody had formally assigned but that everyone had fallen into because it functioned. He was 17 in March. He did not seem 17 in the way that 17 usually felt. He seemed like a person who'd covered a great deal of territory in a short time and had integrated most of it without losing the essential thing that made him who he was, which was a quality of fundamental decency that Mara had watched him maintain through every difficult thing the last 2 years had handed him. She was proud of him in a way that didn't have a clean outlet, and so just sat in her chest most of the time, quiet and large. Cole submitted a formal written assessment of the ranch's horse stock, health, condition, projected needs for the following year, to Caleb in April. He was 13 and he'd written it in the same small, precise handwriting he'd used for his notes in the veterinary manual, and it was, according to an actual veterinarian who came through the valley that spring and whom Caleb had asked to look at it, thorough and largely correct. The veterinarian had asked who'd written it, and Caleb had told him, and the man had stood there for a moment and then asked if Cole was available to talk. Cole talked to the veterinarian for 2 hours. He came back from that conversation different in a way that was invisible and total, the way a person is different when they've been shown for the first time that what they do is not just useful, but is, in the formal language of an adult world, a real thing. Milo's notebook had, by May, become a ranch management document in everything but name. Caleb had taken to consulting it without ceremony, the same way he consulted any useful record. When one of the new hands asked where to find the previous week's water round data, Caleb had pointed him toward Milo without breaking his sentence, and the hand had gone, and Milo had sat up about half an inch without appearing to notice he'd done it. Benji learned to ride in April. It did not go smoothly. There were 3 separate falls in the first week, none of them serious, and after the third one, Benji sat in the dirt of the paddock for a long moment, and Caleb crouched beside him, and Mara watched from the fence. "You want to stop?" Caleb asked. Benji looked at the horse, then at Caleb. "No," he said, "but I want to know if it gets easier." "Yes," Caleb said, "slower than you want, but yes." Benji considered this. "Okay." He got up. He got back on. He was riding without help by May. Mara and Caleb's own arrangement moved with the same slowness that everything real moved with. Not because either of them was avoiding it, but because they were both people who understood that building something on an unsteady foundation was worse than building it late. They had been in the same house for 5 months. They had managed a legal fight and a social campaign and a winter and the daily work of a ranch with reduced labor. They had sat at the same table and worked on the same problems and disagreed twice and been right about different things at different times. What had grown between them was not the thing you could describe in clean terms. It was more specific than affection and more complicated than partnership. It was the thing that happens between 2 people who've seen each other under pressure and kept finding something worth respecting. It was a Tuesday in May when Caleb came in from the field earlier than usual and found her at the kitchen table with the accounts. And instead of going to the sink or sitting across from her, he sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and said, "I want to talk to you about something." She put down her pen. "All right." He looked at the table for a moment. He was not a man who rehearsed things, and this had clearly not been rehearsed, which was evident in the way he started and stopped once before he got to what he meant. I know it started as a practical arrangement," he said, "and I know you came here not knowing what you were coming to. And you had every reason to hold back, and I think you did, and I did too." He stopped. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing all right," she said. He looked at her. Something in him was open in a way she didn't see often. "I want this to be permanent," he said, "not because the arrangement works, though it does. Not because of the ranch. Because of—" He stopped again. "Because of you, specifically." She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, which she'd been careful about for months in a way she was only now recognizing as a form of protection. He was not a handsome man, as he'd said in his first letter. He was a man whose face told the truth, which was rarer and more useful. "The boys," she said. "The boys are part of my family," he said. I'm not saying that as a condition. I'm saying it as a fact." He looked at her steadily. "Wyatt, Cole, Milo, Benji, they're mine. Whatever you decide, that doesn't change." She felt something move in her chest that she'd been holding still for a long time. She'd started over 3 times. She knew what it cost. She'd learned to be suspicious of things that felt like they might hold, because the things that felt like they might hold were the things that broke you when they didn't. But she also knew, in the specific, unglamorous way of someone who'd watched a man work beside her sons for 5 months without a single moment of performance, what it looked like when something was real. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay, yes? Or okay, you heard me?" "Okay, yes," she said. Something in his face shifted, and it was not a triumphant expression. It was a quieter one. A man who'd been carrying something heavy and had just been allowed to put it down. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it when you could," she said. "That's all anyone does." They were married in June, in the front room of the ranch house, with the 4 boys present and Gruber and his wife as witnesses, and no ceremony beyond the legal requirement. Benji asked if there would be cake, and was told there would be cake, and he accepted this as sufficient. Wyatt stood beside his mother with the expression he'd been working on all spring. The one that was not the wall, not the careful watching, but something more like the face of a person who has arrived somewhere he wasn't sure he'd get to. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. After, Caleb walked out to the north fence with Wyatt in the early evening. The 2 of them going out to check the line the way Wyatt did most evenings now, and Mara watched them go from the porch. She watched them walking through the long grass in the last of the day's light. The tall man and the nearly as tall boy, not talking yet, just moving through the land together with the ease of people who'd learned each other's pace. She thought about what it meant to choose a life instead of inheriting one. She thought about the difference between the family you're given and the family you build, and how building is harder and slower and doesn't come with any guarantees, and how none of that changes what it's worth when it holds. She thought about the train platform in January, with mud on her knees and her suitcase broken, and Benji asking what they'd done wrong. She thought about what she would say to that woman now, if she could reach back 5 months and sit beside her in the cold. She would not say it gets easier, because it didn't, not really. It got different. It got more solid. It got people in it who knew how to carry their share. She would say, "Stay. You've started over before and you know what that costs, but you don't yet know what it builds. Stay long enough to find out." Benji came out the door behind her with cake on his face and marker at his heels and the entirely unself-conscious energy of a 7-year-old who'd gotten what he'd wanted and was ready to announce the next project. "Mama," he said, "I've been thinking about a second dog." "I know you have," she said. "Marker would like a companion," he said. "I've observed him." "You've been observing Marker for 4 months and he seems content." "He seems patient," Benji said. "That's different." She looked at her youngest son. His face was entirely serious. Behind him, Marker sat in the doorway with the steady, observational expression that had earned him his name, watching the yard as though he had been appointed to the task personally. "We'll discuss it," she said. "When?" "When it's time," she said. He accepted this with the particular faith of a child who'd learned that when his mother said, "when it's time," she generally meant it. He sat down on the porch step beside her and leaned against her arm, and she let him, and the evening came down over the ranch, over the fence lines and the pastures and the barn where Cole was likely still reading in the last of the light, over the north field where Wyatt and Caleb were becoming silhouettes against the sky. This was not a perfect life. That was the thing she'd have said to someone who might have expected otherwise. It was not a story that had resolved into ease. Caleb still had his difficult silences and his habit of stating hard things without enough warning. She still woke up at 2 a.m. going through the ledger in her head, still carried the weight of 3 starts over in the way you carry something long enough that you forget it's there until it isn't. Wyatt was still learning how to let his guard down in increments. Cole was still a boy who processed everything alone first. Milo would still tear through a pair of gloves in a week. Benji would always want a second dog. None of that was going to change completely. People don't change completely. They shift, they grow, they build new habits on top of old ones. They make room. What she knew was this: family was not a thing you were handed. It was a thing you decided, and then decided again, and then again. Every morning when the cold came through the window, and the work was waiting, and you got up anyway and went to the people who were counting on you being there. Caleb Dawson had stood on a train platform in January and picked up her broken suitcase and held it shut with his hand. He had answered 6 sentences worth of her letter when everyone before him had answered 3 words or nothing. He had looked at 4 boys standing in the mud and seen, somehow, not a problem, but a beginning. She had not trusted it immediately. She had filed it and watched it and tested it and kept the running ledger, and what the ledger said now, in May, in the last light of an evening that smelled of spring grass and wood smoke, was that some things turn out to be exactly what they appeared to be. Rare, but real. Benji reached up and took her hand without looking at her, the way small children do. Unself-conscious, certain, as though taking your mother's hand is simply what you do when you're sitting somewhere and she's there. She held on. Across the field. Wyatt laughed at something Caleb said. It carried in the evening air. Brief, genuine, belonging entirely to itself. She heard it and said nothing and let it be what it was. Some things you don't narrate, you just let them happen and hold them afterward in the quiet of yourself. In the place where the most important things get kept. The ranch held. The family held. And the frontier, which had always demanded everything from the people who lived on it, had given something back for once. Not gently, not without a fight, but fully, and with both hands.